The resolution
For the
passed
first
at
time,
900 hours
this is
on
finally a
Wednesday
fair
morning with 61 votes in favor, 0 against, and 4 abstentions. The 4 abstentions were the Veth Communion, whose elder communion speaker had sung a 4-minute harmonic of dissent before filing her abstention, and who had then sat in her tier and said nothing further. The Pelari Free Assembly, whose abstention was filed without explanation and widely understood as a commercial hedge. A small species called the Myerth, who had been members of the Assembly for only 12 years, and who had abstained because their delegate had been in the role for 6 months, and had decided correctly that voting on something this significant when she did not yet fully understand the implications was irresponsible. And one other species whose name is not relevant to this account, but whose delegate had abstained for the reason that, as she wrote in her private communication to her home government that evening, she did not believe what was happening was going to work, and she did not want to be in the record as having believed it. The 61 votes in favor represented the largest coalition the Galactic Assembly had ever assembled for a unified resolution. The previous record was 44, for the Compact Reform Agreement of 600 years prior, which had restructured the Assembly's trade arbitration system and which had been, at the time, considered a remarkable achievement of multilateral cooperation. 61 was not remarkable. 61 was unprecedented. 61 was the kind of number that appears in history when enough separate actors have become afraid of the same thing at the same time to temporarily overcome all the reasons they ordinarily have for not agreeing with each other. The thing they were afraid of was humanity. The resolution they had passed was titled, in the Assembly's formal record, the Unified Strategic Posture Declaration regarding the expansion and military capacity of the species designated Homo sapiens. In the informal language of the diplomatic channels that had been active for the 6 months of negotiation that produced it, it was called simply the Coalition. And what the Coalition had agreed to do was what 61 species had decided, separately and then together, was the only remaining option. They had agreed to stop humanity. All of them, at once, together, finally. Earth's diplomatic office received a certified copy of the resolution at 9:17 hours, 17 minutes after the vote. The certification was standard assembly procedure. Any resolution affecting a non-member species was required to be transmitted to that species within 1 hour of passage, with full documentation of the voting record, the resolution's text, and the timeline for implementation. The implementation timeline specified in the resolution was 90 days. 90 days for the coalition's member species to contribute their respective military assets to the unified command structure that the resolution had established. 90 days for the unified command to assemble, organize, and position. 90 days for Earth to respond through whatever diplomatic channel it chose to open, if it chose to open one, which the resolution's text noted was an option available to it, and which the coalition's negotiating committee had included because the Assembly's charter required it, not because anyone in the coalition expected Earth to use it. The resolution had not been written by people who expected a diplomatic resolution. It had been written by 61 species who had read the Wenkov report, or more precisely, who had read the classified summary that the Assembly's Executive Council had prepared from the Wenkov report, which was not the same thing but which contained the report's central finding in condensed form, and who had concluded that the finding meant that normal diplomatic tools were not equal to the situation. If humanity was what the report said it was, a species that revised rather than abandoned, that did not stop trying, that distributed its conflict capacity across its entire population without a ceiling, then the response to humanity had to be the thing that humanity's own history showed was the only effective response to an entity with no ceiling, an opposing force with no ceiling either. 61 species, everything they had, at once. It was, in the coalition's strategic committee's internal documents, described as the threshold approach. They were not trying to defeat humanity in detail, engagement by engagement. They were trying to present a force so total that even humanity's calculation would find it prohibitive. They were trying to find humanity's ceiling by being bigger than it. They had 90 days to find out if they were right. The person who received the resolution at Earth's diplomatic office on Verath Station was not an ambassador. The ambassador was in transit, returning from a posting in the outer systems, recalled we. And the coalition negotiations had reached their final stage 4 weeks prior, expected to arrive in 6 days. The person who received the resolution was the same Clerk Second Adiz Okonkwo who had received the Galactic Compact's peace treaty transmission years before, who was now not a Clerk Second but a senior diplomatic officer with 17 years of experience, and a reputation for the kind of procedural precision that made her the person you wanted handling something important when the person who was supposed to handle it was 6 days away. She read the resolution in full. She logged it. She transmitted it to Earth's government on the priority channel. She sent an acknowledgement of receipt to the Assembly's Secretariat, correctly formatted within the required window. She then made herself tea, because she had learned over 17 years that tea was the appropriate response to situations that required her to be useful for a long time, and this was going to require her to be useful for a long time. Then she sat at her desk and read the resolution again, more slowly, because the first reading had been procedural and the second reading was personal. And when she finished the second reading, she wrote a single line in her working notes that she did not include in any official document but that she kept, and that was recovered by the Historical Archive team 30 years later, and that read, "They have all agreed. All 61. I have been in this office for 17 years and I did not think I would ever see all 61 agree on anything. I need to think about what that means." She thought about it for 6 days while the ambassador traveled, and she arrived at something, and what she arrived at was not fear exactly, but the specific feeling of being present at a moment that was going to be in every history book ever written about this period, and of not yet knowing which side of the moment she was on. The ambassador who returned to Verath Station 6 days after the resolution passed was not Mensuato, who had retired the previous year, but a woman named Dr. Selin Selik, who was 58 years old and who had spent 22 years in Earth's diplomatic service after 11 years as an academic historian specializing in multi-species conflict resolution, which was a background that had in her experience been both useful and occasionally alarming. Because historians who became diplomats have the specific disadvantage of knowing exactly how many times in the historical record the situation they are currently managing has gone badly. She had been watching the coalition's formation for 6 months, following the negotiations through the channels available to her posting, reading the transmitted summaries and the public statements and the 61 separate communiques that each member species had issued when they joined. And she had been doing something that she had learned to do during her academic career, and that she continued to do in her diplomatic one. She had been reading the documents for what they did not say as carefully as she read them for what they did. What the coalition's documents did not say was that any of the 61 species wanted this. They said it was necessary. They said it was proportionate. They said it was the response that the evidence required. None of them said they wanted it. This was, in her historian's reading, significant. A coalition built on necessity rather than desire was a coalition that was looking for an exit from the moment it formed. And a coalition that was looking for an exit would take one if one appeared. And the question was whether an exit could be made to appear before the 90 days elapsed and the unified command reached its operational threshold. She had 6 days of travel, and then whatever time the situation allowed. She spent the travel reviewing everything she had, and she arrived at Verath Station with a plan that was not a plan in the strategic sense, but was a plan in the historian's sense. She knew where she was going to look for the exit, and she knew what it would need to look like, and she knew how to present it, and the rest was the conversation itself, which no plan could fully contain. Earth's government transmitted its formal response to the resolution on the 14th day of the 90-day window. The response was transmitted on the Assembly's certified diplomatic channel, correctly authenticated, addressed to the Coalition's unified command and to the Assembly's Secretariat simultaneously, and it was, in its entirety, 4 pages long. 4 pages was short for a formal diplomatic response to a resolution of this significance. The coalition's legal committee had expected something longer, a detailed counterargument, a legal challenge to the resolution's basis, a request for arbitration, a list of concessions Earth was willing to make in exchange for the coalition's withdrawal. The 4 pages contained none of these things. Our pages contained, in the first paragraph, a formal acknowledgement of the resolution's receipt and a confirmation that Earth had read it in full. The second paragraph noted, without argument or elaboration, that Earth did not recognize the resolution as legitimate under the Assembly's charter, on the specific grounds that the charter's provisions for unified strategic postures required that the posture be directed at a demonstrated threat to the Assembly's member species' security, and that the coalition's documentation did not meet the threshold for demonstrated threat as defined in the charter's security provisions, and that Earth was filing a formal charter challenge with the Assembly's legal division, which was its right under the charter and which the filing would make procedurally active. The third paragraph said that Earth was prepared to discuss any specific grievance that any coalition member had with any specific human action through the Assembly's established dispute resolution process, one at a time, in good faith with full documentation. The fourth paragraph was one sentence. It said, Earth notes that 61 species have found it necessary to unify in order to address what they perceive as the threat posed by one species with a fraction of their combined resources. And Earth considers this the most honest assessment of the actual strategic situation that the coalition could have provided, and thanks them for it. The coalition's legal committee read the fourth paragraph and spent 20 minutes discussing it, at the end of which the committee's chair said, "They're not afraid." And the committee's second member said, "No." And the third member said, "They think this is funny." And the chair said, "I'm not sure funny is the right word." And the second member said, "What is the right word?" And the chair said, "I don't know, but I don't think we planned for it." The phrase that entered the galactic community's cultural vocabulary, the one that became the shorthand for the entire episode in subsequent decades, the one that appeared in histories and analyses and the kind of informal conversations that civilizations have about the things that defined a period, did not come from the formal response. It came from a transmission that Earth's diplomatic office made on the public assembly frequency on the 16th day of the 90-day window, addressed to no one specifically and therefore to everyone, which was a communication choice that Senior Diplomatic Officer Adiz Okonkwo made at 900 hours on that morning after receiving instructions from Ambassador Selick, who had received them from Earth's government, who had written the transmission's text through a process that the historical record suggests involved a great deal of argument and revision, and the eventual decision that the shortest, honest version was the correct version. The transmission was 11 seconds long. It said in standard Galactic, in a voice that was even and clear and contained none of the qualities, no elevation, no drama, no performed composure, of a voice that was trying to sound like something. Earth has received the coalition's resolution and has reviewed its terms. We note that for the first time in our history as a member of this galactic community, we are facing an opposing force that is not larger than us in some respects and smaller in others, not stronger in some domains and weaker in others, but larger and stronger in every measurable dimension simultaneously. We want the coalition to know that we consider this, finally, a fair fight, and we look forward to it. The transmission ended. Odiz logged it and filed the transmission record and went to make tea. In the coalition's unified command center, which had been established on Verath Station's military coordination floor, and which contained the senior military and diplomatic representatives of 61 species, the transmission was received and then played again, in the specific silence of a room that has just heard something it did not anticipate, and is taking a moment before deciding what to respond to first. The charter challenge that Earth's legal division filed on day 14 was not, in the assessment of the Assembly's legal division, a strong challenge. The legal division's senior counsel reviewed it within 48 hours of filing and produced an internal memo that rated its probability of success at approximately 22%, on the grounds that the Charter's definition of demonstrated threat had been interpreted broadly in previous applications, and that the Coalition's documentation, while not meeting the threshold in the strictest reading, was within the range of interpretations that the Assembly's legal precedent supported. 22% was not nothing. It was also not the point, and Ambassador Selick, who had filed the challenge knowing the 22% figure from Earth's own legal assessment, knew it was not the point. The point was that the challenge was active. An active charter challenge meant that the Coalition's resolution was under legal review, which meant that the Assembly's procedural rules required the Coalition to delay implementation of any action specified in the resolution until the challenge was adjudicated, which the legal division's timeline estimated at 4 to 7 months, which was 4 to 7 months beyond the 90-day window. Which meant that the unified command that was assembling at various staging points across Coalition space was assembling into a legal hold and could not move. The Coalition's legal committee filed a motion to expedite the adjudication. The Assembly's legal division granted expedited review, which reduced the timeline to 2 to 4 months. The Coalition's legal committee filed a motion to treat the challenge as frivolous and dismiss it without full review. The Assembly's legal division denied the motion, on the grounds that a challenge was not frivolous if it raised a colorable legal argument, and Earth's challenge raised a colorable legal argument, and the denial was correct, and everyone in the room knew it, and the 2 to 4 months stood. In the 2 to 4 months that the legal challenge created, 61 separate diplomatic conversations began. Not officially, not through any channel the Coalition had authorized or that Earth had formally opened. They began in the way that conversations between large institutions actually begin. In corridors, in dining facilities, in the margins of scheduled meetings about other things, between individuals who had reasons to talk to each other that were separate from the resolution, and who, having started talking, found their way to it. The Chethani Mercantile Republic's trade liaison on Varath Station had a working relationship with his counterpart in Earth's commercial office that had existed for 11 years across 3 administrations and 2 species-level political crises. They had lunch together twice a month. They had lunch twice a month during the 90-day window. On the third lunch, the Chethani liaison said, with the directness that characterized his professional style, the Republic's participation in the Coalition is primarily a function of corridor access concerns. If the corridor access concerns were addressed through the framework process that Earth proposed 18 months ago and that the Republic's previous administration declined to enter, the Republic's participation in the Coalition would be more difficult to sustain politically. Earth's commercial officer said, "We are prepared to open the framework process." The Chethani liaison said, "I will communicate this to the Republic's current administration." He communicated it. The current administration, which had not been the administration that declined the framework process and which therefore did not have the same political investment in having declined it, received the communication and authorized preliminary discussions. The preliminary discussions began on day 31 of the 90-day window. They were not the only preliminary discussions that began in that window. They were the first. The Reth Dominion's participation in the Coalition had been, from the beginning, the one that mattered most strategically. The Reth contributed the largest single military asset package, 400 vessels of the Dominion's border fleet, and without the Reth contribution, the Coalition's unified command fell below the threshold the Strategic Committee had determined was necessary for the threshold approach to be credible. The Reth had joined the Coalition because their border with human space was the longest and most contested, and because the 12 years of corridor disputes and contested zone settlements had produced in the Dominion's strategic community a settled conviction that the situation was not stable, and that instability at the border scale the Reth shared with humanity was the Dominion's most significant long-term security risk. This conviction was not wrong. It was the accurate reading of a real situation. What Ambassador Selleck had identified in her 6 days of travel and her review of the coalition's documents was that the Wraith Dominion's conviction was also the thing most likely to respond to a specific kind of offer, because a conviction about instability was a conviction that could be addressed by stability, and stability was something that a framework agreement, properly designed, could provide in ways that a unified military force could not. She requested a meeting with the Wraith Dominion senior delegate on day 18. The meeting was granted on day 22. She spent 4 hours with the Wraith delegate in the same kind of room that all important meetings happened in, formal, slightly uncomfortable, designed for precision, and she put on the table an offer that she had spent 6 days of travel preparing and that addressed, specifically, the 12 Yi. R's of contested border situations in terms of a permanent joint commission with defined authority and enforcement capacity that neither party could manipulate. The Wraith delegate asked questions. Selleck answered them. The delegate asked, "Why is Earth offering this now under these circumstances when you declined to offer it 18 months ago?" Selleck said, "We did not decline. The previous framework proposal did not include the commission structure because we had not yet designed it. We have designed it now." The delegate said, "You designed it in the 6 months since the coalition began forming." Selleck said, "Yes." The delegate said, "That is very fast." Selleck said, "We had a strong incentive to work quickly." The delegate looked at her for a moment. He said, "The 4th paragraph of your formal response. Earth considers this a fair fight." Selleck said, "Yes." He said, "Did you mean it?" She said, "Every word." He said, "Then you are not afraid of what 61 species can do." She said, "We did not say we were not afraid. We said it was fair." He said, "There is a difference." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I am going to transmit this offer to Dominion Command. I want you to understand that I am transmitting it as an alternative to the coalition operation, not as a supplement to it." Selleck said, "I understand." He said, "And if Dominion Command declines," she said, "then we have the conversation that follows from that." He said, "You have planned for that conversation." She said, "We have planned for every conversation we could anticipate." He said, "And the ones you could not anticipate," she said, "those are the ones you show up for and handle when they arrive." He was quiet again, longer this time. Then he said, "I will transmit the offer." The legal challenge was adjudicated on day 73 of the 90-day window. The Assembly's legal division ruled against Earth on the primary argument, finding that the coalition's documentation met the threshold for demonstrated threat under the Charter's security provisions as previously interpreted, and ruling for Earth on a secondary procedural argument that required the coalition to resubmit 3 sections of its documentation in revised form before implementation could proceed. The resubmission requirement added 22 days to the implementation timeline. The coalition's legal committee received the ruling and immediately began the resubmission. Ambassador Selleck received the ruling and noted it in her working log and continued the conversations that had been ongoing for 57 days. 14 of the 61 coalition members had, by day 73, opened bilateral framework discussions with Earth's diplomatic office on specific grievances. 6 of those 14 had reached preliminary agreements. The Chethani Mercantile Republics had initialed a corridor access framework on day 51. The Wraith Dominion's command had transmitted, on day 44, an authorization to continue discussions, which was not a withdrawal from the coalition, but was a hold on their military contribution pending the outcome of those discussions, which had the practical effect of reducing the coalition's unified command's available assets below the Strategic Committee's credibility threshold. 3 other species had filed similar holds, citing ongoing diplomatic engagement with Earth within the following 2 weeks. The coalition's Strategic Committee met on day 60 and spent 8 hours reviewing its operational status and produced, at the end of those 8 hours, an internal assessment that the committee's chair described in her private correspondence as, "We are watching the coalition dissolve one conversation at a time, and we do not have a mechanism to stop it because the conversations are being conducted correctly, and the offers being made are genuine and our members are accepting them because the offers address the actual problems and we built this coalition to address the actual problems. And if the actual problems are being addressed, then the coalition has no purpose, which is the outcome we wanted." And I cannot decide whether to be relieved or frustrated, and I think I am both. The unified command never reached operational status. On day 88 of the 90-day window, with the resubmission deadline 4 days away and the coalition's military contribution reduced by 31% from holds filed by members in active bilateral discussions with Earth, the coalition's coordinating committee called an extraordinary session. The session was attended by representatives of all 61 member species. It lasted 11 hours. What was discussed in those 11 hours was documented in the session's official record, which was one of the more honest official records in the Assembly's history. Because the committee's chair had decided at the session's outset that the record would reflect what was actually said rather than what was diplomatically convenient, and had in force. This decision with the specific authority of someone who understood that the document being created was going to be read by historians, and that historians who read dishonest records produce histories that embarrass everyone. What was actually said was, in summary, the coalition had been assembled to present an opposing force so total that humanity's calculation would find it prohibitive. The coalition had not achieved totality, because totality required all 61 members to maintain their contributions, and 14 members had reduced or suspended their contributions in response to bilateral negotiations that were producing real results on real grievances. The coalition could proceed with its remaining assets, but proceeding with reduced assets against the threshold approach's logic was proceeding with a diminished argument, and a diminished argument against a species that had publicly characterized the opposition of 61 species as finally a fair fight was an argument that had already told the other side something it could use. The committee's chair said at the 11-hour mark, with the directness that 11 hours of honest conversation produces, we need to decide what we are doing and why. If the coalition's purpose was to stop humanity's expansion, and humanity's expansion is being addressed through bilateral negotiations that our members are entering and that are producing agreements, then the coalition's purpose is being achieved without the coalition's military operation. If the coalition's purpose was something else, if it was to demonstrate that this community can unify against a common concern, then we have demonstrated it, and the demonstration produced the negotiations, and the negotiations are producing the agreements, and I am going to call that a success even though it does not look like the success we planned for, because the success we planned for was not going to produce stable agreements, and the success we are getting might. The coalition's coordinating committee voted on day 89 to suspend the resolution's implementation timeline pending a review of the bilateral negotiation outcomes, which was a procedurally precise way of saying that they were not going to do what the resolution had authorized them to do, not because they had been defeated, but because the situation had changed in a way that made doing it unnecessary. The vote was 44 in favor of suspension, 12 against, and 5 abstentions. The 12 against were the species whose bilateral negotiations with Earth had not yet produced agreements, and who therefore had not received the same offset that was making the other 44 willing to suspend. The committee's chair noted in the session's closing remarks that the suspension was conditional on the bilateral negotiations continuing in good faith and reaching outcomes within a defined period, and that if negotiations stalled, the suspension could be reversed, and that this conditionality was the thing that kept the coalition functionally active as a political entity even in suspension, because an entity that could reverse course was an entity with continued relevance. And continued relevance was how you maintained the leverage that had produced the negotiations in the first place. This was, Ambassador Selleck noted in her working log when the suspension was announced, a correct and sophisticated reading of the situation, and she wrote in the margin of that log entry a single word, good, because what the coalition's chair had just described was not the end of the coalition. It was the coalition becoming what it should have been from the beginning, a multilateral framework with enforcement capacity, built on genuine grievances, capable of real resolution, and structured in a way that gave all parties an ongoing stake in the outcomes. It had taken 90 days of a military threat and 57 days of parallel conversations to get there. And the getting there had been neither clean nor comfortable, but the structure that had emerged was real. And real structures were what durable things were built on, and durable was the goal, and Selick, who was a historian and therefore had a long view of what durable meant, thought, reading the session record, that this one might last. The transmission that Earth's government sent to the Assembly's public record on day 90, the day the original implementation timeline would have elapsed, was short. It was 3 sentences. It said, Earth notes that the 90-day window established in the Coalition's resolution has elapsed without the implementation of the resolution's military provisions. Earth thanks the 61 member species for the conversations of the past 74 days, which have been productive and which Earth intends to continue in good faith. Earth also wishes to note, for the record, that it remains available for that fair fight whenever the Coalition decides it is ready and will keep the appointment as long as necessary. The transmission was signed by Ambassador Selick, which was a small procedural irregularity since public record transmissions were typically signed by a government official rather than a serving ambassador, and which Selick had done deliberately because it was her transmission and her record, and she had spent 22 years in diplomatic service earning the right to put her name on the things she believed in. Senior diplomatic officer Adiz Okonkwo received the transmission before it went out because it passed through the Verath Station diplomatic office on its way to the Assembly's public channel, and she read it and then she sent a personal message to Ambassador Selick that said, the last line. Selick responded in 3 minutes, which meant she had been waiting for the message. The response said, yes. Okonkwo replied, they're going to read that for 100 years. Selick replied, longer. Okonkwo thought about this for a while, then she went to make tea. The tea was the same tea she had been making for 17 years at the same desk in the same office on Verath Station. And the desk had a view of the station's outer corridor, where the species of the galaxy walked past in the ordinary daily way of a place where many kinds of beings had decided to be in the same space at the same time, and Okonkwo watched them for a while. Thinking about the 90 days that had just elapsed and the conversations that had happened in them and the suspension that had emerged from them and the record that now existed of all of it. And she thought about the fair fight that Earth had said it was looking forward to. And she thought about what the phrase had done, not threatened, not intimidated, not escalated, but changed the room, changed the calculation, changed the 61 species' understanding of what they were actually dealing with, and she thought. That is what a fair fight means to them. Not a fight they can win. A fight where the other side knows what they're getting into. A fight where the terms are honest. A fight where both parties understand that the outcome is not guaranteed and are willing to show up anyway. And 61 species had assembled to end humanity, and humanity had said. Finally, and had meant it, and the finally had done more than 47 vessels or 400 or 1,000 could have done. Because it had told the truth about what humanity was in a way that no fleet composition and no legal filing and no diplomatic maneuver could have told it. And the truth had changed everything, the way truth does when it arrives in a room that has been full of calculations, and reminds everyone present that underneath the calculations there is always, eventually, the thing that is actually true, and the thing that was actually true was that humanity was not afraid of 61 species united against it. Not because humanity was larger than 61 species. It was not. And not because humanity was stronger, it was not. But because humanity had read its own history, and its own history had told it something that 61 species' histories had not told them. Which was that the size of the opposition was not the variable that determined whether you kept going, and that the opposition being large did not mean the fight was unfair. And that a fair fight was not one you were certain to win, but one where both sides understood what they were choosing and chose it anyway. And humanity had been choosing it for 300 years, and 61 species had assembled to find its ceiling, and humanity had looked at the ceiling and said, finally, someone built it high enough. The bilateral framework agreements that emerged from the 90-day window and the negotiations that followed it took 3 years to finalize in full. 12 species reached agreements in the first 6 months. 23 more in the following year. The final 14, including the 12 who had voted against the suspension, completed their agreements in the third year, the last of them on a Thursday morning that was otherwise unremarkable on Verath Station, where the ordinary daily work of a galactic community continued in the corridors and the offices and the dining facilities where conversations between beings of different species happened constantly, most of them about things that were not historically significant. Which was the condition under which historically significant things became possible. The joint commission that the Reth Dominion and Earth had designed together became the model for 6 of the subsequent framework agreements, which meant that the structure Selleck had put on the table on day 18 of the 90-day window became, across 3 years and 41 separate negotiations, the architecture of a new border and trade management system that the Assembly's Department of Territorial Affairs formally incorporated into its operational framework 4 years after the coalition's. Sion, the department's director, in the remarks she gave at the incorporation ceremony, noted that the system's design had originated in a bilateral proposal made during a period of maximum political tension and said, "I want to say clearly that this is the best possible origin for a system of this kind, because a system designed under pressure to address real problems is more likely to address those problems than a system designed in the abstract and applied later." The coalition, she said, had done something that no one in the coalition had intended it to do. It had created the conditions under which the problems it was assembled to solve were actually solved. This was not the outcome anyone planned. It was the outcome that the situation and the conversations it forced and the offers it created the incentive to make had produced. She was a bureaucrat and not a philosopher, she said, and so she would leave the larger implications to others, but she would note for the record that the system they were incorporating bore, in its design, the unmistakable mark of having been built by someone who had thought carefully about what durable meant and had decided to build for it rather than for the immediate crisis. She did not name Ambassador Selleck. She did not need to. Everyone in the room knew whose name belonged there, and the record knew, and the record was what lasted, and lasting was the point, and the point had always been the point. From the first day the coalition assembled to the last signature on the last agreement, and it would be the point long after the people who had lived through it were gone. Because the thing they had built was the kind of thing that outlasts the people who build it, which is the only kind of thing worth building. And humanity had known this for 300 years, which was why it had said finally, which was why the finally had worked, which was why the room had changed, which was why the agreements existed, which was why the commission ran, which was why on Thursday mornings on Verath Station, beings of 61 species walked past each other in corridors and had conversations about things that were not historically significant, which was the condition under which historically significant things became possible. Which was where it had always been, which was where it would always be. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, share it with a fellow HFY fan, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Your support keeps these stories coming.